The sea was the wrong color for a morning like that one. Off the southern coast of Sicily, just after dawn on the 11th of July, 1943, the water around the little town of Gela was streaked with oil and smoke and the gray wakes of 1,000 ships. On the beaches, American soldiers crouched in shallow holes scraped out of the sand, and out beyond them, rolling down from the brown hills to the north, came the tanks. They were real, not patrols, not rumors, Mark IV panzers, and behind them the heavier Mark VI Tigers of the Hermann Göring Division, armored steel grinding across the coastal plain with the rising sun at their backs. They had broken through the thin American line in the dark and the early hours, and now they were less than 2 miles from the water, in places closer. And there was almost nothing left to stop them. The American armor had not made it ashore. The long stone pier at Gela had been blown apart the day before, and the few Sherman tanks that managed to land sat trapped to their fenders in soft sand. A battalion of young, half-trained infantrymen had buckled under the weight of the panzers and begun to fall back toward the surf. The center of the beachhead was folding in on itself. This was the moment the whole invasion could have died. And it was into this, the smoke, the shellfire, the long shadows of the German tanks crawling toward the sea, that a lieutenant general stepped off a landing craft and onto the sand. He did not stay aboard his command ship. He did not watch the battle through field glasses from the safety of the fleet, the way an army commander was expected to. He came down the ramp into ankle-deep water, planted his boots on a beach that was hours from collapse, and walked toward the fighting. His name was George S. Patton, and what he did over the next few hours would help decide whether America's first invasion of Hitler's Europe lived or died on that strip of Sicilian shore. Before we go any further, if stories like this matter to you, the true ones, told plainly, with the facts run down and the legends set straight, take 1 second to subscribe. That simple act is what keeps this work alive. Now let's go back to the beginning, to how an American general ended up standing in the path of a panzer division with the ocean at his back. To understand why Patton was on that beach, you have to understand where he had been just 5 months before. In February of 1943, the United States Army had walked into one of the worst defeats in its young history. At Kasserine Pass, in the mountains of Tunisia, German armor under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had torn through the inexperienced American II Corps and driven it back more than 20 miles. Men threw down their weapons. Whole units came apart. By the time the line finally held, nearly 200 Americans were dead, thousands more wounded, captured, or missing. And the proud army that had crossed the Atlantic looked, to friend and enemy alike, like it did not yet know how to fight. The Germans were contemptuous. Hitler himself had sneered at the fighting quality of the American soldier, and Kasserine seemed to prove him right. Eisenhower needed someone to fix it, and fix it fast. He chose Patton. In 10 frantic days, Patton seized that beaten corps by the collar and shook it back to life. Clean uniforms, iron discipline, relentless drilling. Fines for a man caught without his necktie or his leggings in the middle of a war zone. Because Patton believed that an army that respected itself in the small things would hold together in the large ones. And everywhere his men turned, there he was, in a scout car, at the front, watching, barking, pushing. Weeks later, at a place called El Guitar, that same corps stood its ground against German tanks and threw them back. It was the first time in the war that American soldiers had beaten the Germans in a stand-up fight. Patton had taken a humiliated army and handed it back its spine. Now in July, he was being given something far bigger. The target was Sicily, the rocky, triangular island wedged between Tunisia and the toe of Italy. Take Sicily, and the Allies would command the Mediterranean, open the road to the Italian mainland, and force Hitler to pull strength away from the Russian front. The operation was codenamed Husky, and at that moment, it was the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted by any nation in history. More than 160,000 troops, carried by better than 3,000 ships, landed along 100 miles of hostile coast. The British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, would come ashore in the southeast. Patton's job, with his newly christened Seventh Army, was to land to the west, at Licata, at Skogliti, and in the center at the small fishing port of Gela, and to shield Montgomery's flank while the British drove for the city of Messina. On paper, it was a supporting role. Patton intended to make it something more. The invasion began in darkness on the night of July 9th, and almost at once the weather turned against it. A hard wind rose out of the northwest, kicking the sea into heavy swells that pitched the landing craft and scattered the formations. Worst hit were the paratroopers, 3,400 men of the 82nd Airborne, led in by Colonel James Gavin's 505th Parachute Infantry. It was the first American combat jump of the war, and the wind flung the transport planes off course and spilled the men in scattered handfuls across miles of dark Sicilian countryside, far from where they were meant to land. But the same storm that wrecked the drop also lulled the defenders. The Italian and German commanders looked out at that churning Black Sea and decided no one would be reckless enough to land in it. They eased their guard, and in the small hours, the boats came in anyway. In the center, the way into Gela was led by the Rangers, Colonel William Darby's 1st and 4th Ranger Battalions, hard men trained for exactly this kind of work. They were hit by fire while still 500 yards offshore and lost an entire platoon before their boots touched land. But they pushed through the mined beach and into the streets of the town, and by 8 o'clock that morning, Gela was theirs. The Axis High Command had a plan to throw them right back into the sea. It came first on July 10th, the very day of the landings. The Italian Livorno Division and a mobile armored group rolled down toward Gela with tanks and infantry. But their tanks were old, light Fiats, hopelessly outmatched. Darby's Rangers met them in the streets and on the edge of town, fighting with rifles, with mortars, and at one point with captured Italian artillery pieces. They swung around and fired back at their former owners. Out at sea, American destroyers and cruisers opened up, and the Italian attack came apart under the weight of naval shellfire. The Rangers herded hundreds of dazed prisoners out of the wreckage. But the day held its own terrors. Overhead, the Luftwaffe came again and again. In one strike, German bombers hit an American ammunition ship, the Robert Rowan, lying off the beach. She went up in a single towering blast that sailors miles away said they could feel in their chests, a pillar of smoke standing over the shore like a marker for the whole battle. The fighting at Gela was not yet a victory. It was a knife balanced on its edge, and the Germans had not yet truly been heard from. The German commander facing Gela was not a man who gave up easily. His name was Paul Conrath, and he led the Hermann Göring Division, a powerful armored formation built around panzers and panzer grenadiers. His first thrusts on the 10th had been clumsy and uncoordinated, fed in piecemeal and beaten back. Through the night, Conrath pulled his scattered columns together into a single fist, and at 6:15 on the morning of July 11th, he sent them forward again, this time in real strength, a hammer blow of armor aimed straight at the heart of the American beachhead. This was the attack that nearly worked. The panzers came on hard, grinding through the thin defensive line. On the German left, the heavy tanks punched clean through, scattering one American unit and rolling on toward the sea. In the center, a battalion of the 26th Infantry, many of them green replacements seeing combat for the very first time, cracked under the sheer shock of the armor and began streaming back toward the beach. The anti-tank guns that should have met those tanks were at the bottom of the Mediterranean, gone down with the landing ship that had carried them. By 9:30, all along the front, the Americans were being shoved backward toward the water, and the Sherman's Patton needed to answer. The panzers were still stuck, bogged in the soft sand, or sitting useless on the wrong side of a shattered pier. That was the situation when Patton came ashore. He landed in the middle of it, around 9:30 in the morning, with the German armor closer to the beach than it had been at any moment of the entire invasion. A more cautious commander would have stayed well clear, would have run the crisis from a radio room safely offshore, and no one could have faulted him for it. Patton walked straight into Gela. He found Darby's Rangers in the town, hard-pressed, enemy armor grinding in from the northwest, barely a mile away. He came up behind a young Ranger captain named James Lyle, who was in the thick of it, directing his men under fire. and in the middle of a battle teetering on the edge of catastrophe, Patton's very first act was to dress the captain down for wearing his helmet chin strap unbuckled. It sounds almost absurd, but it was pure Patton, the discipline of the small thing, even here, especially here. Then he listened to Lyle's report, and then he gave the order that mattered. "Kill every one of them," he told the ranger, and he meant everyone. He did not stop there. He went down to the water's edge, to the wrecked pier, where Army engineers were laboring under fire to clear a path so the tanks could finally land. Patton stood among them and drove them on. He wanted those Shermans ashore, and he wanted them now. Men who saw him that morning remembered the same thing. The commanding general of the whole 7th Army, out in the open, sharing the danger, refusing to be anywhere but where the battle was hottest. But the blow that truly broke the German attack came from the sea. Off the coast, the light cruisers Boise and Savannah had their guns trained on the Gela plain, and their spotters could see the panzers in the open. When the German armor pushed down off the high ground and onto the flat coastal plain, it rolled into open ground and into the path of those naval guns. The cruisers opened fire. 6-inch shells, each one the weight of a small motorcycle, came down among the tanks. The Savannah alone poured some 500 rounds onto the advancing column. Across the 2 days of fighting, the cruisers and their escorting destroyers hurled more than 3,700 rounds into the Axis attacks. On the open plain, the effect was annihilating. German tanks were torn apart, set ablaze, left as smoking hulks scattered across the fields. The handful of American Shermans that finally clawed their way off the beach added their fire to the storm. Historians still debate exactly how much credit belongs to the Navy's guns and how much to those few tanks. That argument has never fully settled. But by the time it was over, the Hermann Göring Division had lost roughly a third of its armor in that single engagement, and its attack had been shattered. By early afternoon, Conrad's panzers were pulling back the way they had come. The line at Gela held. The beachhead and the invasion had survived. It is worth being clear about what Patton did and did not do that day. He did not lead a bayonet charge. He did not personally knock out a tank. What he did was rarer and in its own way harder. At the precise hour when the battle could have been lost, the commanding general of the entire 7th Army was not safe aboard a ship miles out to sea. He was on the beach, under fire, in the streets of a burning town, pushing his engineers, steadying his rangers, willing the fight forward by the sheer weight of his presence. The soldiers who were there never forgot that the old man had come up to stand in the danger with them. And there was a lesson in that day that reached far beyond Gela. Patton had been a cavalryman and a tanker, and like many Army officers, he had quietly doubted that the Navy's guns could do much for men fighting on land. Gela cured him of that doubt for good. He had watched naval gunfire break an armored division in the open, and from that day forward the close cooperation of ships, artillery, tanks, and infantry, what soldiers came to call combined arms, became part of how the American Army fought. The hard lessons paid for on that beach would be paid forward at Salerno, at Anzio, and on the beaches of Normandy. The victory was real. So was the cost. The fighting around Gela was savage, and the days that bracketed it brought their own tragedies. On the very next night, a wave of American transport planes flew reinforcements in over the fleet, and anti-aircraft gunners on the ships and the shore, their nerves shredded by days of relentless Axis bombing, mistook them for the enemy and opened fire on their own aircraft. More than 20 planes were shot down. Hundreds of young paratroopers were killed or wounded by friendly fire before they ever reached the ground. Gela was a triumph. It was not a clean one. They almost never are. But the beachhead held, and from it the 7th Army broke out across the island. Within 2 weeks, Patton would drive his men all the way to Palermo, within a few more to Messina itself. And the shock of the Sicilian invasion reached all the way to Rome. Within a fortnight of the landings, Benito Mussolini was stripped of power and placed under arrest, the first of the Axis dictators to fall. It all turned in part on a few hours on a beach, on a general who refused to watch from the rear. There is an image worth holding on to. A man with 3 stars on his collar, standing in the wet sand of Gela with the ocean at his back, and German tanks somewhere ahead in the smoke, close enough to hear, close enough to die by, choosing to walk toward them rather than away. He had taken a beaten army at Kasserine and taught it to stand. Now on a Sicilian shore, he stood with it. That was the whole of it. When the line was breaking and the easy thing was to step back, George Patton stepped forward. And the men around him watching found that they could step forward too. That is what leadership looked like at Gela. Not a speech, not a medal, a pair of boots in the sand facing the right direction. If this story moved you, do the small things that help us tell the next one. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and tap the bell so you never miss what comes next. These are the stories of the men who stood when standing was hard, and they deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching.